Hey guys, tonight we will understand why it sucked to be a medieval blacksmith. We must begin at the very beginning of the workday, which would start well before dawn. The life of a blacksmith was structured around the demands of the forge and the needs of the community, and there was no room for sleeping in or taking one's time in the morning. The blacksmith would need to rise in the cold darkness, often by the sound of a church bell or simply by habit developed over years of early rising. The sleeping arrangements for a medieval blacksmith would be quite basic. Most blacksmiths lived in modest homes attached to or very near their workshops, as the forge required constant attention and security. The blacksmith would sleep on a simple straw mattress or perhaps slightly better feather mattress if he was relatively prosperous. The bed would be in a small room with minimal furnishings, and in winter it would be very cold, as there would be no heating in the sleeping area. The only warmth in minimal furnishings, and in winter it would be very cold, as there would be no heating in the sleeping area. The only warmth in the house would come from the forge itself or from a small hearth in the main living area. Waking in the darkness before dawn, the blacksmith would feel the cold immediately. His breath would form clouds in the frigid air, and getting out from under the blankets would require willpower and discipline. There would be no warm shower to wake him up, no coffee maker with a timer to have hot coffee ready. Instead, he would need to rise, dress quickly in the cold, and begin his day with only the most minimal preparations. The clothing of a medieval blacksmith would be practical and designed for hard work rather than for comfort or appearance. He would wear a rough wool or linen tunic, woolen hose or breeches, and leather shoes or boots. Over this, he would wear a thick leather apron that would protect him somewhat from the heat of the forge and from the sparks and hot metal that would be constant hazards. The leather apron would be heavy and would become stiff and uncomfortable over time, cracked from heat and stained with soot and sweat. Before beginning work, the blacksmith would need to attend to basic necessities. He would splash cold water on his face from a basin, though he would not wash thoroughly, as that would require heating water and would take time that needed to be devoted to work. He would relieve himself in an outhouse or chamber pot, and he would perhaps eat a small breakfast of bread and ale or cheese if there was any available. This breakfast would be eaten quickly, standing up or sitting on a bench, with no ceremony or enjoyment. It was simply fuel for the long day ahead. The first task of the day would be to start the fire in the forge. This was not a simple matter of flipping a switch or lighting a match. The blacksmith would need to clear the forge of ash and clinker from the previous day's fire, a big dirty job that would coat his hands and clothes with fine ash. He would need to arrange the coal or charcoal carefully in the forge, building a proper base that would allow air to flow through and feed the fire. He would need to find embers from the previous day's fire if any had survived overnight, or he would need to create a new fire using flint and steel to create sparks that would catch on tinder. Starting a fire with flint and steel was a skill that required practice and patience. The blacksmith would strike the steel against the flint repeatedly, creating sparks that would hopefully land on the tinder, which might be dried plant material, charcloth, or other easily ignited material. Once a spark caught, he would need to blow gently on the tinder to encourage the flame without extinguishing it. This process could take several minutes on a good day and much longer on a damp or cold morning when everything was reluctant to burn. Once a small flame was established, the blacksmith would carefully add kindling small pieces of wood that would catch fire from the initial flame. As the kindling burned, he would gradually add larger pieces until he had a fire sufficient to ignite the coal or charcoal. Coal was the preferred fuel for blacksmithing, as it burned hotter than wood and created the temperatures necessary for working iron. However, coal needed to be purchased and was an ongoing expense that ate into the blacksmith's profits. As the fire began to grow, the blacksmith would use a bellows to force air into the fire, increasing its temperature. The bellows was a large leather bag that could be compressed to force air through a nozzle into the forge. Operating the bellows was physically demanding work, requiring the blacksmith to pump the handle repeatedly, compressing and expanding the bellows in a steady rhythm. The motion was repetitive and would strain the arms and shoulders, but it was essential for achieving the high temperatures needed to heat iron to the point where it could be worked. While the forge was heating, the blacksmith would survey the work that needed to be done. He might have orders from customers for various items, including horseshoes, nails, tools, hinges, locks, weapons, or countless other iron objects that were essential to medieval life. He would need to prioritize this work based on which customers had been waiting longest, which items were most urgent, and which work would be most profitable. This mental planning would be complicated by uncertainty about how long each task would take and by the possibility of new urgent requests arriving during the day. The temperature in the workshop would begin to rise as the forge heated up, but this would not make the blacksmith comfortable. In winter, the workshop would still be quite cold, except immediately near the forge, creating a situation where one side of the blacksmith's body would be hot while the other remained cold. In summer, the heat from the forge would add to the already oppressive warmth, making the workshop stifling and causing the blacksmith to sweat profusely. By the time the forge was properly heated and ready for work, an hour or more might have passed since the blacksmith first woke. This preparatory work was necessary every single day and could not be skipped or rushed. The blacksmith would already be tired from the physical labor of starting the fire and working the bellows, and his actual productive work had not yet begun. The day stretched ahead, filled with hours of hot, demanding, repetitive labor that would leave him exhausted by evening. Chapter 2. The physical demands of blacksmithing. The work of a blacksmith was extraordinarily physically demanding, requiring strength, stamina, and tolerance for discomfort that would be difficult for most modern people to comprehend. Let us examine in detail the various ways that the physical labor of blacksmithing would wear down the body, and make each day a trial of endurance. The most obvious physical demand was the heat. The forge needed to reach temperatures of approximately 2500 to 2700 degrees Fahrenheit to heat iron to the point where it could be worked effectively. This intense heat radiated from the forge, creating a zone of extreme temperature immediately around the work area. The blacksmith would spend hours standing near this heat source, and the effect on the body would be cumulative and debilitating. The heat would cause profuse sweating, and the blacksmith would lose significant amounts of water and salt through perspiration. In the medieval period, there was no understanding of hydration or electrolyte balance, so the blacksmith would simply drink water when he felt thirsty, which might not be adequate to replace what he was losing. Dehydration would lead to fatigue, headaches, dizziness, and reduced physical capacity, but the blacksmith would have no choice but to continue working through these symptoms. The radiant heat from the forge would also cause burns. Despite the leather apron and careful movements, the blacksmith would inevitably be struck by sparks or would accidentally touch hot metal or the edge of the forge. These burns would be painful and would create blisters and scars. Over years of working at the forge, the blacksmith's hands and forearms would become covered with burn scars, creating a permanent record of his occupation. Some burns would become infected, as there was no understanding of antiseptics or proper wound care, leading to additional pain and potentially serious illness. Beyond the heat, the physical act of forging iron was exhausting. The blacksmith would remove a piece of iron from the forge using tongs, place it on the anvil, and strike it repeatedly with a hammer to shape it. This process sounds simple, but it required tremendous physical effort. The hammer would weigh several pounds, and the blacksmith would need to swing it repeatedly with force and accuracy, striking the hot iron in exactly the right spot to shape it as desired. A single piece might require hundreds of hammer blows to shape correctly. The blacksmith would need to heat the iron in the forge, hammer it until it cooled to the point where it could no longer be worked, return it to the forge to reheat, remove it, and hammer it again, and repeat this cycle many times. Each heating and hammering cycle would require the same intense physical effort, and the cumulative effect over the course of a day would be overwhelming. The motion of swinging the hammer was hard on the shoulders, elbows, and wrists. The impact of striking the iron was jarring and would travel up the arm into the shoulder. Over time, this repetitive impact would cause chronic pain in the joints and might lead to conditions like arthritis. Medieval blacksmiths did not have the benefit of modern ergonomic tools or techniques to reduce strain, and they certainly did not have access to physical therapy or anti-inflammatory medications. They would simply work through the pain until their bodies could no longer function. The posture required for blacksmithing was also problematic. The blacksmith would need to stand for about hours, bent slightly forward over the bola anvil in a position that put strain on the lower back. Standing on hard floors for extended periods would cause pain in the feet and legs. The combination of standing, bending, and the jarring impacts from hammering would create chronic back pain that would worsen over years of work. The physical environment of the smithy would contribute to other health problems. The burning coal or charcoal would produce smoke, And while smithies typically had chimneys or vents to allow smoke to escape, the ventilation would be imperfect. The blacksmith would breathe in smoke and fumes throughout the workday, and this would damage his lungs over time. Coal smoke contains various toxic compounds, and long-term exposure would lead to respiratory problems, including chronic cough, difficulty breathing, and further rest and failure to lung infections. The fine particles of metal that would be created when hammering hot iron would also become airborne, and the blacksmith would inhale these metal particles. Over years of exposure, these particles would accumulate in the lungs and could cause serious respiratory diseases. The blacksmith would develop what was called blacksmith's lung, or what we would now recognize as pneumoconiosis, a disease caused by inhaling dust particles. This condition would cause progressive difficulty breathing and would shorten the blacksmith's life. The noise in the smithy would be intense and constant. The ringing of the hammer striking the anvil would create loud, sharp sounds that would reverberate through the workshop. This noise would damage the blacksmith's hearing over time, leading to partial or complete deafness. Medieval people had no understanding of hearing protection, and even if they had, earplugs or other protective devices were not available. The blacksmith would simply lose his hearing gradually as the years passed, accepting this as an inevitable consequence of his trade. The work would also be dangerous in immediate ways beyond the chronic health effects. A piece of hot iron might break when struck, sending sharp fragments flying through the air. These fragments could strike the blacksmith or anyone nearby, causing cuts or puncture wounds. The blacksmith might miss his strike and hit his hand or fingers with the heavy hammer, causing crushed bones or other serious injuries. He might drop a heavy piece of iron on his foot, breaking bones. All of these accidents would occur without the benefit of modern emergency medical care. The physical demands meant that blacksmithing was a young man's trade. In many ways, a blacksmith would typically begin his apprenticeship as a boy and would work through his 20s and 30s when his physical strength was at its peak. By his 40s, the accumulated damage to his body would begin to seriously impair his ability to work. By his 50s, if he lived that long, he might be largely unable to continue the heavy physical labor of blacksmithing and would need to rely on assistants or apprentices to do the actual forging while he supervised and did lighter tasks. The life expectancy of a medieval blacksmith was probably shorter than the already low average life expectancy of the medieval period. The combination of hard physical labor, exposure to heat and smoke, the risk of accidents and burns, and the chronic health problems that developed from the work all contributed to wearing out the blacksmith's body. A man who survived childhood and became a blacksmith might expect to live to his 50s if he was fortunate, but many would die younger from accidents, infections resulting from injuries, or from the cumulative effects of their occupation. Understanding the physical demands of blacksmithing helps us appreciate why it was such a difficult way to make a living. The blacksmith would wake each morning with sore muscles, aching joints, lungs that burned from breathing smoke, and the knowledge that he faced another day of the same punishing labor. The work would never get easier, and his body would never fully recover from one day's work before the next day began. It was a life of continuous physical suffering endured because there was no alternative and because the skills of the blacksmith were essential to the community. Chapter 3: The economic realities of the trade. While the physical demands of blacksmithing were severe, the economic aspects of the trade presented their own set of challenges that would make life difficult and stressful. A medieval blacksmith was not simply a craftsman but also a small business owner who needed to manage finances, deal with customers, purchase materials, and somehow make enough money to support himself and his family. Let us examine the economic realities that would make being a blacksmith financially precarious. The blacksmith would need to maintain a workshop with all the necessary equipment and tools. The forge itself was a significant investment, typically a stone or brick structure with a chimney and a hearth where the fire would burn. The anvil, which was the blacksmith's most important tool, was a large piece of iron or steel that was expensive to purchase and difficult to replace if damaged. A good anvil might cost the equivalent of several months of income, and a blacksmith might use the same anvil for his entire career if he took care of it. In addition to the forge and anvil, the blacksmith would need various hammers of different sizes and weights, tongs of different shapes for holding different types of work, chisels, punches, and other specialized tools. He would need a bellows to force air into the forge, and this bellows would need to be maintained and eventually replaced as the leather developed leaks. He would need a water trough for cooling hot metal, and he would need a supply of water to keep it filled. All of this equipment represented a significant capital investment that would need to be made before the blacksmith could begin earning money. The ongoing cost of fuel was substantial. Coal or charcoal was expensive, and a blacksmith would burn through large quantities of it each day. The coal would need to be purchased from a dealer and transported to the smithy, and both the purchased price and the transportation cost would eat into the blacksmith's profits. In regions where coal was scarce or expensive, the blacksmith might need to use charcoal, which was made by partially burning wood in a low-oxygen environment. Charcoal was less efficient than coal and required larger quantities to achieve the same heat, making it even more expensive to use. The cost of raw materials was another major expense. The blacksmith would need to purchase iron, which in the medieval period was produced by smelting iron ore in furnaces and then refining it to remove impurities. Iron point was valuable and was not always readily available, particularly during times of war, when much of the iron production was directed toward making weapons. The blacksmith would need to maintain a supply of iron in various forms, including bars, rods, and plates, and he would need to purchase more iron regularly to keep up with customer demands. The price of core iron fluctuated based on availability and the demand, and the blacksmith had no control over these market conditions. In times when iron was scarce and expensive, his costs would rise, but he might not be able to increase his prices proportionally if his customers were also struggling economically. This would squeeze his profit margins and might force him to take on debt to purchase the iron he needed to fulfill orders. The blacksmith's income came from the items he produced and sold to customers. The types of work a blacksmith did varied widely and included making horseshoes for horses and oxen, producing nails and other fasteners, creating and repairing tools for farmers and craftsmen, making locks and keys, producing chains, creating decorative ironwork for buildings, and making weapons and armor. Each type of work had its own challenges, its own profit margin. Horseshoes were a common product, as horses were essential for transportation and for agricultural work. A blacksmith might shoe several horses in a day, charging a fee for each horse. However, the work was relatively routine and did not command a high price. The profit margin on horseshoes was modest, and the blacksmith would need to do a large volume of this work to make a decent living. Additionally, horses would kick, bite, and resist having their feet handled, making the work of shoeing them physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. Making nails was another common task, though it was tedious and repetitive. The blacksmith would take an iron rod, heat it in the forge, cut it to the appropriate length, hammer one end flat to form the head of the nail, and taper the other end to form the point. This process would be repeated for each nail, and a customer might order hundreds or thousands of nails at a time. The profit margin on nails was very low, as nails were simple objects and many blacksmiths could produce them, creating competition that kept prices down. Creating tools required more skill and commanded higher prices. A blacksmith might make plows, hoes, axes, saws, chisels, and various other implements for farmers and craftsmen. These items required more time and expertise to produce them, creating competition that kept prices down. Creating tools required more skill and commanded higher prices. A blacksmith might make plows, hoes, axes, saws, chisels, and various other implements for farmers and craftsmen. These items required more time and expertise to produce than horseshoes or nails, and the blacksmith could charge more for them. However, these orders were less frequent, as tools might last for years before needing replacement, so the blacksmith could not rely on tool making alone for steady income. Weapons and paint armor were the most profitable items a blacksmith could produce, but they required the highest level of skill and were subject to legal restrictions in many regions. Swords, spearheads, arrowheads, and armor needed to be made to exacting standards, as a warrior's life might depend on the quality of the metalwork. The best blacksmiths who could produce quality weapons would be valued and could command good prices, but most ordinary blacksmiths did not have the skills or the reputation to secure these lucrative contracts. The blacksmith would need to negotiate prices with customers, and this negotiation would often be difficult. Many customers would be poor and would haggle over every penny, trying to get the blacksmith to reduce his prices. The blacksmith would be torn between wanting to charge enough to make a fair profit and needing to keep prices low enough that customers would not go to a competitor. In small towns and villages, there might be only one blacksmith, giving him some monopoly power, but in larger towns, competition between blacksmiths would keep prices down. Some customers would try to cheat the blacksmith by refusing to pay for work after it was completed, by claiming the work was defective when it was not, or by paying with coins that were debased or counterfeit. The blacksmith would have limited recourse in these situations, as taking a customer to court would be expensive and time-consuming. He might refuse to do future work for customers who had cheated him, but if the customer was powerful or influential, the blacksmith might have no choice but to accept the loss and continue dealing with them. The blacksmith would also face irregular income. There would be busy periods when many customers needed work done, and the blacksmith would work long hours to fulfill orders. There would be slow periods when few customers came, and the blacksmith would have little work and little income. This irregularity made financial planning difficult, and the blacksmith would need to save money from busy periods to cover expenses during slow periods. However, saving was difficult when income was barely adequate even in good times. The blacksmith would be responsible for supporting his family on his income. If he was married, his wife might contribute by managing the household, by helping with lighter tasks in the smithy, such as keeping accounts or handling customers, or by doing other work such as spinning or weaving. If the blacksmith had children, they would be expected to help with household tasks and eventually to learn the trade, if they were sons. However, children also represented additional mouths to feed and would be a financial burden until they were old enough to contribute meaningfully to the family's income. The blacksmith would also face various taxes and fees. Depending on the Bont region and time period, he might need to pay taxes to the Bont local lord, fees to the town government, and dues to a blacksmith's guild if one existed in his area. These payments were mandatory and would further reduce his already modest income. Failure to pay could result in fines, loss of the right to practice his trade, or other serious consequences. The precarious financial situation meant that the blacksmith lived with constant economic stress and anxiety. He would worry about whether he had enough money to purchase the coal and iron he needed. He would worry about whether customers would pay him. He would worry about whether he could support his family. He would worry about whether he could support his family. He would worry about whether he could support his family. He would worry about whether he could support his family. He would worry about what would happen if he became ill or injured and could not work. This economic insecurity would be a heavy psychological burden that would make his difficult physical work even harder to endure. Understanding the economic realities of blacksmithing helps us see why it was such a challenging occupation. The blacksmith was not a prosperous craftsman living comfortably from his skilled labor. He was a struggling small businessman, barely making ends meet, working punishing hours at physically demanding labor, and living in constant fear of economic disaster. The combination of physical suffering and financial stress would make being a medieval blacksmith truly miserable. Chapter 4: The social position of the Bont blacksmith. The social status of a medieval blacksmith was complex and somewhat contradictory, and understanding this status is important to comprehending the full experience of being a blacksmith. On one hand, blacksmiths were respected for their essential skills. On the other hand, they were viewed with some suspicion and were often marginalized in various ways. Let us examine the social dimensions of the blacksmith's life and pant why these would add to the difficulties of the occupation. Blacksmiths were essential members of medieval communities. Without blacksmiths, farmers could not have the iron tools they needed to work the land. Without blacksmiths, horses could not be shod and wagons could not be repaired. Without blacksmiths, horses could not be shod and wagons could not be repaired. Without blacksmiths, buildings could not have proper locks and hinges. Without blacksmiths, warriors could not have the weapons and armor they needed. The skills of the blacksmith were so essential that communities made sure to have at least one blacksmith, and larger towns might have several specializing in different types of work. This essential nature meant that blacksmiths were valued and were generally able to make a living from their work. A competent blacksmith would always have customers and would not face the possibility of unemployment in the way that some other occupations might. The security of having a necessary skill was a significant advantage, and this helped maintain the blacksmith's position in the community. However, the status of craftsmen in medieval society was complicated by the rigid social hierarchy. Society was theoretically divided into three orders: those who prayed, which was the clergy; those who fought, which was the nobility; and those who worked, which included everyone else from prosperous merchants to landless laborers. Within this third order, there were many gradations, and craftsmen like blacksmiths occupied a middle position. They were above simple laborers, but below wealthy merchants, and certainly far below the nobility. The work of a blacksmith was seen as somewhat crude and low status compared to more refined crafts. The blacksmith worked with heavy materials, got dirty and sweaty, and produced utilitarian objects rather than objects of beauty or luxury. This was less prestigious than crafts such as goldsmithing or fine woodworking that produced decorative items for the wealthy. The physical nature of the work and the smoke and grime of the smithy contributed to the perception of blacksmithing as a rather rough and unglamorous occupation. There was also an element of suspicion or even fear associated with blacksmiths in medieval culture. The ability to work with fire and iron to transform raw materials into useful objects through seemingly magical processes created a joint sense that blacksmiths had access to mysterious or supernatural powers. In folklore and legend, blacksmiths were sometimes portrayed as having dealings with the devil or with dark forces. This was not a literal belief held by most people, but it created an undercurrent of unease around blacksmiths. The noise and smoke from the smithy would make blacksmiths somewhat unwelcome neighbors. The constant ringing of hammer on anvil would disturb nearby residents, and the smoke would blow over neighboring properties, creating complaints. In some towns, blacksmiths and other noisy or dirty trades were required to set up their workshops in specific areas away from the better parts of town, essentially segregating them from more respectable businesses and residences. The blacksmith's social interactions would be shaped by his occupation and status. He would be a member of the working community and would socialize with other craftsmen and with farmers and laborers. He would not be part of the elite social circles, would not be invited to noble gatherings, and would be expected to show deference to his social superiors. When a nobleman or wealthy person came to his smithy, the blacksmith would need to be respectful and deferential, addressing them with proper titles and accepting whatever terms they offered for work without much negotiation. Disputes with customers or neighbors could be difficult for the blacksmith to resolve, as his relatively modest social status meant he had limited power and influence. If a powerful customer refused to pay, or if a neighbor complained about the noise and smoke from the smithy, the blacksmith would have little recourse beyond appealing to local authorities who might or might not take his side. The blacksmith could not afford to offend important people and would need to swallow his pride and accept unfair treatment to maintain his position in the community. In some regions and time periods, blacksmiths were organized into guilds, which were associations of craftsmen that regulated the trade. Guilds could set standards for quality, could limit competition by restricting who could practice the trade, and could provide mutual support for members who fell on hard times. Being a member of a guild provided some protection and some social identity, as the blacksmith would be part of a recognized corporate body with some legal standing. However, guilds also imposed restrictions and requirements on their members. A blacksmith who belonged to a guild would need to pay dues, would need to follow guild rules about how work could be done and what could be charged, and might be required to participate in guild ceremonies and activities. The guild might limit the number of apprentices a blacksmith could train, might restrict what types of work he could do, and might fine him for violations of guild regulations. While guilds provided some benefits, they also added another layer of control over the blacksmith's work and life. The blacksmith's family would also be affected by his social position. His wife and children would share his status, and prospects would be shaped by it. His daughters might be able to marry craftsmen or farmers, but would not be able to marry far above their station. His sons might follow him into blacksmithing or might enter other trades, but they would not have opportunities to rise significantly in social status unless they had exceptional abilities or luck. The blacksmith would be expected to participate in community life in ways that were appropriate to his status. He would attend church regularly and would be expected to contribute to church fundraising efforts and to support religious activities. He would participate in community work projects and would help maintain roads, bridges, and other infrastructure. He would be expected to serve in the town militia, if there was one, and to provide military service, if required by his lord. All of these obligations took time away from his work and added to his burdens. The social position of the blacksmith was thus one of modest respectability combined with definite limitations and some margination. He was valued for his skills, but was not highly esteemed. He had some security and social standing but also faced restrictions and had limited power. This ambiguous social position would contribute to a sense of being neither particularly successful nor particularly respected, adding a psychological dimension to the already significant physical and economic challenges of the occupation. Understanding the social aspects of being a blacksmith helps us see another way in which the occupation was difficult. The blacksmith could not take pride in high social status, could not expect to rise in the world, and could not protect himself effectively against exploitation by those above him in the hierarchy. He was trapped in a position that was necessary, but not prestigious, skilled but not refined, secure but not prosperous. This social reality would make the hard physical work and the economic struggles even more difficult to bear. Chapter 5: The Daily Routine and Work Environment. Having examined the physical, economic, and social challenges of being a blacksmith, let us now look in detail at the actual daily routine and the work environment, exploring the moment-to-moment experience of a typical workday. This will help us understand why the cumulative effect of the blacksmith's daily life would be so exhausting and oppressive. After the morning preparations and the starting of the forge fire, which we discussed earlier, the blacksmith would begin his actual productive work. The day would be structured around a series of tasks that needed to be completed, and the blacksmith would move from one task to the next with little variation in routine from one day to the next. The repetitive nature of the work would be one of its most tedious aspects. Let us follow the blacksmith through a typical task, such as making a horseshoe. This was a common job that most blacksmiths would do frequently. The blacksmith would begin by selecting an iron bar of the appropriate size. He would place one end of the bar in the forge, burying it in the burning coal and using the bellows to bring the fire to a high temperature. He would wait several minutes for the iron to heat, watching the color change from dull red to bright red to orange to yellow, indicating that it was approaching the proper working temperature. When the iron reached the bright color, the blacksmith would quickly remove it from the forge using tongs. The iron would be glowing brightly and radiating intense heat. He would carry it to the anvil, which was positioned near the forge for exactly this purpose, and would immediately begin hammering the hot iron. Each blow of the hammer would flatten and spread the iron slightly, and the blacksmith would work quickly, remove it from the forge using tongs. The iron would be glowing brightly and radiating intense heat. He would carry it to the anvil, which was positioned near the forge for exactly this purpose, and would immediately begin hammering the hot iron. Each blow of the hammer would flatten and spread the iron slightly, and the blacksmith would work quickly, rotating the piece and striking it from different angles to shape it as desired. The hammering would create a loud, ringing noise that would echo through the smithy and would be audible from some distance away. The vibration from each impact would travel up the blacksmith's arm. After a minute or less of hammering, the iron would cool to the point where it became too stiff to work effectively, and the blacksmith would need to return it to the forge for reheating. This cycle of heating, hammering, and reheating would be repeated many times until the horseshoe began to take shape. The blacksmith would need to judge by eye and experience when the iron was properly shaped. There were no precise measuring tools, no templates, no guides beyond the blacksmith's accumulated knowledge. He would need to remember the approximate size and shape that a horseshoe should have, and he would need to hammer the iron until it matched this mental image. This required concentration and skill, as a mistake could ruin the piece and would waste the time and varying materials already invested. Once the basic horseshoe shape was achieved, the blacksmith would need to create the nail holes. He would heat the horseshoe again and then use a punch, which was a pointed tool, to drive holes through the hot iron. The punch would be placed on materials already invested. Once the basic horseshoe shape was achieved, the blacksmith would need to create the nail holes. He would heat the horseshoe again and then use a punch, which was a pointed tool, to drive holes through the hot iron. The punch would be placed on materials which would be positioned on the anvil, and then the blacksmith would strike the punch with it from different angles to shape it as desired. The hammering would create a loud, ringing noise that would echo through the smithy and would be audible from some distance away. The vibration from each impact would travel up the blacksmith's arm. After a minute or less of hammering, the iron would cool to the point where it became too stiff to work effectively, and the blacksmith would need to return it to the forge for reheating. This cycle of heating, hammering, and reheating would be repeated many times until the horseshoe began to take shape. The blacksmith would need to judge by eye and experience when the iron was properly shaped. There were no precise measuring tools, no templates, no guides beyond the blacksmith's accumulated knowledge. He would need to remember the approximate size and shape that a horseshoe should have, and he would need to hammer the iron until it matched this mental image. This required concentration and skill, as a mistake could ruin the piece and would waste the time and materials already invested. Once the basic horseshoe shape was achieved, the blacksmith would need to create the nail holes. He would heat the horseshoe again and then use a punch, which was a pointed tool, to drive holes through the hot iron. The punch would be placed on the horseshoe, which would be positioned on the anvil, and then the blacksmith would strike the punch with and hammer rod after rod, cutting each to length and forming heads and points in a repetitive rhythm. If he was making a tool, he would shape the metal carefully, perhaps adding a handle or creating specific features like a cutting edge. If he was doing repair work, he would assess what was wrong with the item, determine how to fix it, and then heat and hammer and perhaps weld pieces together to restore functionality. The work environment of the smithy would be harsh throughout the day. The heat from the forge would be intense and unrelenting. In summer, the combination of the forge heat and the outdoor temperature would make the smithy almost unbearably hot. The blacksmith would be drenched in sweat, and his clothing would become soaked. The leather apron would become heavy with sweat and would chafe against his body. He would drink water frequently, but it would never be enough to fully replace what he was losing. In winter, the situation would reverse. While the immediate area around the forge would be hot, the rest of the smithy would be cold. The blacksmith would experience the strange sensation of being too hot on the side, facing the forge, while being cold on his back and sides. The transition between the hot area and the cold areas would be uncomfortable, and the blacksmith would never feel properly warm or cold, but rather would be in a state of thermal confusion. The blacksmith would experience the strange sensation of being too hot on the side, facing the forge, while being cold on his back and sides. The transition between the hot area and the cold areas would be uncomfortable, and the blacksmith would never feel properly warm or cold, but rather would be in a state of thermal confusion. The light in the smithy would be dim except for the glow from the forge. There would be no electric lights, and windows would be small to prevent heat loss in for winter. The blacksmith would work by the light of the forge and perhaps by the light of a few candles or oil lamps, but these would provide minimal illumination. The dim lighting would strain his eyes, and detailed work would be difficult. Over time, the strain would contribute to deteriorating vision, and many blacksmiths would develop eye problems as they aged. The smoke and fumes from the forge would fill the smithy despite the chimney. The air would be hazy and would have an acrid smell from the burning coal and from the various materials being heated. Breathing this air hour after hour, day after day, would irritate the throat and lungs. The blacksmith would develop a chronic cough, and he would spit up black phlegm from the coal dust and metal particles he inhaled. This respiratory damage would worsen over the years and would eventually make it difficult to breathe even when not actively working. The blacksmith would have little opportunity for breaks or rest during the workday. If he stopped working, the fire in the forge would begin to die down, and reheating it would waste time and fuel. The work had a natural rhythm where the iron needed to be heated, worked, and reheated in continuous cycles, and interrupting this rhythm would reduce efficiency. Customers might be waiting for their orders, and delays would reflect poorly on the blacksmith's reliability. The pressure to keep working would be constant. A midday meal would be brief and would be eaten without ceremony. The blacksmith might step away from the forge long enough to eat some bread and cheese or perhaps a bowl of pottage, but he would return to work quickly. The meal would not be particularly satisfying, and the blacksmith would remain hungry and tired throughout the afternoon. His energy would gradually decline as the day wore on, but the work would continue at the same demanding pace. By late afternoon, the blacksmith would be thoroughly exhausted. His arms would ache from swinging the hammer. His legs would be tired from standing all day. His back would hurt from bending over the anvil. His lungs would burn from breathing smoke. His eyes would be strained from working in dim light. Yet he would need to continue working until he had completed the day's orders or until darkness made it impossible to continue. As evening approached, the blacksmith would begin to bank the forge fire, covering it with ash to preserve the coals so that starting the fire would be easier the next morning. He would clean up the work area somewhat, though this would be cursory, as he would be too tired for thorough cleaning. He would put away tools, would secure any valuable materials, and would make sure the smithy was safe to leave unattended overnight. Finally, after 12 or more hours of work, the blacksmith would retire to his living quarters. He would be filthy, covered in soot, sweat, and coal dust. He would wash minimally with cold water, as heating enough water for a proper bath would require more energy than he had. He would eat a simple evening meal, probably similar to his midday meal, and then would collapse into bed. He would fall asleep quickly from sheer exhaustion, and his sleep would be deep but not refreshing, as his body would be too damaged and depleted to fully recover in a single night. The next morning, the entire routine would begin again. Day after day, year after year, the blacksmith would follow this same pattern of exhausting physical labor in harsh conditions. The work would never get easier, and the toll on his body would accumulate. This daily grind, the endless repetition of the same difficult tasks, the constant discomfort and pain, would make being a medieval blacksmith a truly miserable existence. Chapter 6. Apprenticeship and learning the trade. To fully understand the blacksmith's life, we must also consider how one became a blacksmith in the first place. The system of apprenticeship through which young people learned trades in medieval times was itself a difficult experience that involved years of hard work and exploitation. Let us examine what it would be like to train as a blacksmith and why this process would be so challenging. A boy who was to become a blacksmith would typically begin his apprenticeship around age 10 to 14. The decision about his future would be made by his father or guardian, not by the boy himself. If his father was a blacksmith, the boy might learn the trade from his father. Otherwise, his family would need to find a master blacksmith who was willing to take on an apprentice, and this would require negotiating the terms of the apprenticeship. The apprenticeship agreement would typically last 7 years, though the length varied by region and circumstance. During this time, the apprentice would live with the master blacksmith's family, would work in the master smithy, and would gradually learn the skills of the trade. In exchange for this training, the apprentice would provide labor and corn. Often the apprentice's family would need to pay a fee to the master for taking on the burden of training the boy. The life of an apprentice would be hard and would involve much more drudgery than skilled work, especially in the early years. The apprentice would be responsible for the most menial and unpleasant tasks around the smithy. He would need to rise early to start the fire, which we described earlier as a laborious process. He would need to pump the bellows for hours while the master worked at the forge, providing the airflow necessary to maintain the pumping high temperatures. This work would be boring and exhausting, and the apprentice's arms would ache from the constant pumping. The apprentice would fetch water, carry coal, clean out the ashes and clinker from the forge, run errands to purchase supplies or deliver finished work to customers, and perform countless other tasks that freed the master to focus on the actual skilled work of forging metal. For the first few years, the apprentice might do almost no actual metalworking and would instead serve primarily as an unskilled laborer. The master blacksmith had complete authority over his apprentice, and this authority could be exercised harshly. The master could beat the apprentice for mistakes, for perceived laziness, or simply for discipline. Physical punishment was accepted as a normal part of apprenticeship, and apprentices were expected to endure it without complaint. The apprentice could not leave or refuse to work without serious consequences, as breaking an apprenticeship contract could result in legal penalties and would make it difficult to find another master willing to take him on. The living conditions for an apprentice would be poor. He would sleep in the workshop or in a simple room with minimal comfort. His food would be basic, and he would eat the same simple fare as the rest of the household, which might be adequate or might be insufficient depending on the prosperity of the master. He would have no personal freedom, no time for leisure or play, and no say in how he spent his time. His childhood would effectively be over, replaced by years of hard labor and harsh discipline. As the apprenticeship progressed, the apprentice would gradually be allowed to do more skilled work. He might be allowed to hammer simple pieces while the master supervised. He would learn to judge the temperature of the iron by its color. He would practice making nails, which was considered beginner work because it was relatively simple and repetitive. He would learn to shape iron into basic forms, to create joints by welding pieces together, to harden iron by proper heating and cooling. All of this learning would occur through observation and practice, rather than through formal instruction, as the master would demonstrate techniques, but would not necessarily explain the principles behind them. The apprentice would make many mistakes, and each mistake would be an opportunity for punishment or titled criticism. He might overheat a piece of iron and burn it, ruining it for the intended purpose. He might strike the iron at the wrong angle, creating an unintended shape. He might misjudge the timing and return a piece to the forge too soon or too late. All of these errors would waste materials and time, and the master would be angry and would make sure the apprentice understood his displeasure. Despite the harsh conditions, the apprentice would be motivated to learn because completing his apprenticeship was his only path to becoming an independent craftsman. If he could endure the years of training, he would eventually have the skills necessary to work as a journeyman, blacksmith, or to set up his own shop if he could raise the capital. This prospect of future independence would help him tolerate the present hardship. After serving his time as an apprentice, the young man would become a journeyman, which meant he had completed his training but was not yet a master. Journeymen would work for wages in the shops of master blacksmiths, or they might travel from place to place, seeking work and gaining additional experience. A journeyman would be paid for his work, but the wages would be modest, and he would not have the status or security of a master. To become a master blacksmith and to have the right to set up his own shop and take on apprentices, the journeyman would need to meet certain requirements. In places where guilds existed, he would need to create a masterpiece, a piece of work that demonstrated his skill and that would be judged by the guild masters. He would also need to pay fees to the guild and would need to prove that he had sufficient capital to establish a workshop. These requirements could take years to fulfill, and some journeymen would remain in that status for their entire careers, never achieving master status. For those who did become masters, the daunting investment of years of harsh apprenticeship and then years of work as a journeyman would finally result in the ability to run their own smithy. However, as we have discussed, being a master blacksmith was itself a difficult life filled with hard work, economic stress, and physical suffering. The apprentice who dreamed of one day being his own master might be disappointed when he discovered that achieving that goal did not bring the comfort and prosperity he had imagined. The apprenticeship system meant that the suffering of being a blacksmith began in childhood or early adolescence and continued throughout one's working life. The skills that seemed valuable from the outside were acquired through years of grueling labor and harsh treatment. And even after mastering the trade, the blacksmith would find that his life was still one of constant toil with modest rewards. The entire trajectory from apprentice to journeyman to master would be one of unrelenting difficulty, making blacksmithing a truly unappealing occupation when viewed in its totality. Chapter 7. Conclusion and Final Reflections. As we conclude this extensive examination of why it sucked to point to be a medieval blacksmith, we must consider the totality of the experience and reflect on how all of these difficulties would combine to make this occupation truly miserable by modern standards. Every aspect of the blacksmith's life, from the moment he woke before dawn to the moment he collapsed into bed exhausted at night, would be characterized by discomfort, danger, and hardship. The physical demands alone would be enough to make the forge and occupation nearly unbearable. The intense heat from the forge, the heavy physical labor of swinging a hammer for hours, the damage to lungs from breathing smoke and metal particles, the burns and injuries that would occur regularly, the chronic pain in joints and back from repetitive motions and awkward postures, all of these would take a severe toll on the body. A blacksmith would age prematurely, would suffer from chronic health problems, and would likely die younger than Hansi might have in a less demanding occupation. The economic realities would add financial stress to the physical suffering. The blacksmith would work hard every day but would barely make enough to support himself and his family. The costs of fuel and raw materials would eat up much of his income, and customers would haggle over prices or would refuse to pay, leaving the blacksmith with little profit from his labor. The irregularity of income and the lack of any safety net would create constant anxiety about money, and the blacksmith would live with the fear of economic disaster always in the back of his mind. The social position of the blacksmith would provide little compensation for the hardships. While the blacksmith's skills were necessary, he was not highly respected or prestigious. He was a middle-rank craftsman, neither wealthy nor destitute, neither powerful nor powerless, occupying an ambiguous position that provided some security but little opportunity for advancement. The noise and smoke from his work would make him an unwelcome neighbor, and folklore would cast some shadow of suspicion over his ability to work with fire and iron. The daily routine would be mind-numbingly repetitive. Day after day, year after year, the blacksmith would perform the same tasks, in the same ways, with little variation. The work would never become easier through practice, as the physical demands would remain constant. Even as the blacksmith became more skilled, the lack of intellectual stimulation, the endless repetition, the absence of any hope that things might improve, all of these would create a psychological burden that would make each day harder to face. The path to becoming a blacksmith would begin with years of harsh apprenticeship, during which a young boy would be subjected to hard labor, physical punishment, and minimal comfort. After completing his apprenticeship and working as a journeyman, he might eventually become a master and have his own shop. But this achievement would simply mean that he now bore all the responsibilities and stresses of running a business in addition to continuing to do the hard physical work of blacksmithing. There would be no retirement, no pension, no social security. The blacksmith would work until his body could no longer function, at which point he would need to rely on his family to support him or would face destitution. If he had trained sons or apprentices, they might take over the heavy work while he supervised and did lighter tasks, but if he had no such help, he would simply have to continue working, despite pain and disability, until he died. The medieval blacksmith had few of the things that make work bearable in the modern world. There were no labor laws limiting working hours or mandating safe working conditions. There was no workers' compensation if he was injured on the job. There was no health insurance to help with medical care. There were no ergonomic tools designed to reduce strain. There was no safety equipment beyond the crude leather apron. There were no labor-saving devices or power tools to make the work easier. There was no prospect of career change if he decided he wanted to do something else. He was trapped in his occupation, bound by the investment of years in learning the bond trade and by the lack of other opportunities. The modern person, transported back in time and compelled to work as a medieval blacksmith, would find the experience horrifying. The physical pain, the heat, the smoke, the noise, the endless hard labor, the economic insecurity, the lack of respect, the absence of any real hope for a better future, all of these would be overwhelming. Within days, the modern person would be desperate to escape. Within weeks, if somehow forced to continue, they would be broken in body and spirit. Yet, medieval blacksmiths endured this life because they had no choice and because they had never known anything better. They were born into a world where hard physical labor was the norm for most people, where comfort and security were luxuries available only to the wealthy, and where suffering was accepted as an inevitable part of life. The blacksmith was at least somewhat better off than a landless laborer or a serf bound to the land, and this relative advantage, modest as it was, made blacksmithing a viable, if difficult, way to make a living. Understanding why it sucked to be a medieval blacksmith helps us appreciate the vast improvements that have been made in working conditions, safety, economic security, and quality of life over the past several centuries. Modern blacksmiths and metal workers, if they exist at all in traditional forms, work with power tools, temperature controls, ventilation systems, safety equipment, and ergonomic designs that make the bot work far easier and safer than it was in medieval times. Most metalworking is now done in factories with mechanized processes that require minimal human physical labor. The physical suffering, the economic precariousness, the social marginalization, the endless toil, all of these aspects of the medieval blacksmith's life are largely gone from modern working life in developed countries. We have labor laws, safety regulations, workers' compensation, health insurance, retirement plans, and countless other protections that medieval workers could not have imagined. The average modern person works fewer hours for more pay in better conditions with more security than any medieval worker, even skilled craftsmen like blacksmiths. As you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and comfortable with your body free from pain and your lungs breathing clean air with economic security and modern medical care available if you need it, take a moment to appreciate how extraordinarily fortunate you are. You will never need to stand for 12 hours in front of a blazing forge swinging a hammer until your arms can barely move. You will never breathe coal smoke and metal dust until your lungs are blackened and your breath comes with difficulty. You will never worry about whether you can afford to buy the materials you need to do your job or whether customers will pay you for your work. The world of the medieval blacksmith is gone, and good riddance to begin. Its smithy with its heat and smoke and danger is no longer a necessary part of every community. The skills that once took years of harsh apprenticeship to learn are now largely obsolete or are performed by machines. The physical suffering and economic struggle that characterize the blacksmith's life have been eliminated through technological progress and social change. Sleep well, dear listener, secure in the knowledge that you live in a modern world where even the most physically demanding jobs are far easier than being a medieval blacksmith. The heat, the smoke, the endless hammering, the chronic pain, the economic anxiety, all of these are safely in Beers of the past, preserved only in historical records and in boring sleep stories, like this one. The medieval smithy is cold and empty now, the forge dark, the anvil silent, and we are all better off for it. Chapter 8. The tools and their maintenance beyond the physical and past economic challenges we have discussed. The medieval blacksmith faced the constant burden of maintaining and replacing his tools, which were essential to his livelihood, but which were subject to wear, damage, and loss. Let us examine in detail the various tools the blacksmith faced the constant burden of maintaining and replacing his tools, which were essential to his livelihood, but which were subject to wear, damage, and loss. Let us examine in detail the various tools the blacksmith used and the challenges associated with keeping them functional. The anvil was the centerpiece of the smithy and the most expensive tool the blacksmith owned. A good anvil would be made of wrought iron with a hardened steel face welded on top. This steel face was necessary because iron alone would deform under the repeated hammer blows. The anvil would weigh anywhere from 75 to several hundred pounds, and it would be mounted on a sturdy wooden stump or frame that held it at the proper working height. Over time, the anvil face would become worn and pitted from constant use. Each hammer blow would create a tiny indentation, and thousands of blows would accumulate into noticeable wear. The edges of the anvil, where delicate work was done, would become rounded and less sharp. The hardy hole, which was a square hole in the anvil used for holding certain tools, would become enlarged and damaged. Eventually, the anvil face might crack or develop other serious damage that would impair its usefulness. Repairing an anvil was difficult and expensive. The damaged steel face would need to be ground down and perhaps re-hardened, or in serious cases, a new steel face would need to be forge welded onto the anvil body. This work required specialized skills that not all blacksmiths possessed, and it might require sending the anvil to another smith who specialized in such repairs. The cost of repair might be substantial, but the cost of replacing the anvil would be even greater. So, the blacksmith would have strong incentive to keep his anvil in service as long as possible. The hammers used by the blacksmith would come in various sizes and shapes, each suited for particular tasks. There would be heavy sledgehammers for rough shaping, lighter cross-peen hammers for drawing out and tapering iron, ball-peen hammers for rounding and texturing, and various other specialized hammers. Each hammer would have a wooden handle that fit through a hole in the iron head, with a wedge driven through the top of the handle to hold it tight. The hammer handles would break regularly from the stress of hard use. The repeated impacts would cause the wood to develop cracks and eventually to split or break. When a handle broke, the blacksmith would need to remove the old handle remnants from the hammer head, shape a new handle from a piece of hardwood, fit it into the hammer head, and secure it with a wedge. This process would take time away from productive work, but it was necessary to keep the tools functional. The hammer faces would also wear and deform over time. The striking surface would become dished or uneven from repeated blows, and this would affect the quality of the work produced. The blacksmith might attempt to dress the hammer faces by grinding them flat, or he might simply continue using them as they were and accepting the imperfections. Eventually, big hammers would wear out completely and would need to be replaced, which meant purchasing new ones or making them himself if he had the skills and materials. The tongs used to hold hot iron came in many varieties, each designed for gripping different shapes and sizes of material. There would be flat jaw tongs for gripping flat bars, round jaw tongs for holding round stock, pickup tongs for grabbing small pieces, and many other specialized designs. The blacksmith might own dozens of pairs of tongs, and he would need to select the right pair for each task. Tongs would wear out at the jaws where they gripped the hot iron. The constant heating and cooling would cause the metal to become brittle and to crack. The rivets that held the two arms of the tongs together would become loose or would break. When tongs failed, the blacksmith might be able to repair them by re-riveting them or by building up the worn jaws with welded material, or he might need to make new tongs entirely. Making tongs required skill and time, as they needed to be carefully shaped and fitted to work properly. The chisels, punches, and other cutting and forming tools would become dull and worn from use. The cutting edges would need to be resharpened regularly by grinding or filing, and this maintenance work would be time-consuming. The tools would also break occasionally, particularly if they were struck at the wrong angle or if a flaw in the metal caused them to crack under stress. The blacksmith would need to maintain a stock of these tools and would need to make or purchase replacements as needed. The bellows was a complex tool that required regular maintenance to remain functional. The bellows consisted of leather panels that folded like an accordion, with wooden boards at the top and bottom, and a nozzle that directed air into the forge. The leather would dry out and crack from the heat and would develop leaks that reduced the efficiency of the bellows. The blacksmith would need to oil the leather regularly to keep it supple and would need to patch or replace panels as they wore out. The bellows would also have moving parts including hinges and a valve that allowed air to enter when the bellows expanded but prevented it from escaping backward. These components would wear and would need to be repaired or replaced. A complete replacement of the bellows leather would be a major undertaking that might require the services of a leather worker and would be expensive. However, without functional bellows, the blacksmith could not work effectively, so this maintenance could not be deferred indefinitely. The water trough used for cooling hot iron would seem to be a simple item requiring little maintenance, but it too would present challenges. The joint trough would be made of wood or metal, and either material would deteriorate over time. A wooden trough would develop leaks as the wood swelled and shrank with changes in moisture. The constant heating and cooling from hot iron being plunged into the water would accelerate the deterioration. A metal trough would rust and corrode, especially if the water was not changed regularly, and eventually would develop holes. Maintaining a supply of water for the trough was also an ongoing task. The water would evaporate from the heat of the forge and would be carried away as steam when hot iron was quenched. The blacksmith would need to refill the trough regularly, which meant carrying water from a well or stream. In winter, the water might freeze if the forge was not kept burning constantly, creating another problem to manage. Beyond these major tools, the blacksmith would have numerous smaller items including files for smoothing surfaces, scribes for marking metal, measuring tools, swages and fullers for specialized shaping operations, and various jigs and fixtures for holding work. All of these would need to be maintained, organized, and replaced when worn out. The cumulative burden of tool maintenance would be significant and would represent a constant drain on the blacksmith's time and resources. The need to maintain tools meant that the blacksmith could never simply focus on productive work. He would always need to devote some portion of his time to sharpening, repairing, adjusting, and replacing tools. This maintenance work did not generate income but was essential for keeping the smithy operational. The blacksmith would need to balance the time spent on maintenance against the time spent on paying work, and this would be yet another source of stress and complication in an already difficult occupation. Chapter 9: Seasonal Variations and Weather. The work of a blacksmith was affected by seasonal changes and weather conditions in ways that added further difficulties to an already challenging occupation. Let us examine how the changing seasons would affect the blacksmith and why these variations would make certain times of year particularly difficult. In spring, as the agricultural season began, the blacksmith would be extremely busy. Farmers would bring in their plows, hoes, and other implements that needed repair or sharpening before planting. The winter months might have damaged tools that had been stored, and rust and corrosion would need to be dealt with. The blacksmith would have a backlog of work and would need to work long hours to complete all the repairs and new tools that farmers needed. The spring rains would create problems for the smithy. Water might leak through the roof or seep through the walls, creating puddles and making the floor muddy and slippery. The dampness would make it harder to keep the fire burning properly, as damp coal or charcoal would not burn as efficiently. The high humidity would cause tools to rust more quickly and would make the blacksmith's leather apron and other equipment feel clammy and uncomfortable. In summer, the heat would be the primary challenge. The forge would be just as hot as ever, but now the outside temperature might be 80 or 90 degrees or more. The combination would make the smithy nearly unbearable. The blacksmith would sweat profusely and would struggle to maintain his energy and concentration in pounds the oppressive heat. Customers might be irritable from the heat and would be less patient with delays or problems. The summer would also bring insects. Flies would be everywhere in pounds and peat. By any food, they would land on the blacksmith constantly, and while he worked with hot iron and pounds swung a hammer, he would have no free hand to brush them away. Other insects, including mosquitoes, would bite, adding itching to the other discomforts. The blacksmith would have welts and bites covering his exposed skin, and scratching them would create sores that might become infected. Summer would typically be a somewhat slower period for blacksmithing work, as the major agricultural tasks of planting would be completed and the harvest would still be months away. The blacksmith might have more time to work on larger projects or to build up inventory, but the reduced flow of customers would also mean reduced income. The slow period might be welcome as a chance to rest somewhat, but the financial pressure would make it difficult to truly relax. In autumn, the harvest season would bring another surge of work. Farmers would need tools sharpened and repaired for harvesting, and sickles and scythes would need to be in good condition to cut grain efficiently. After the harvest, farmers would have money from selling their crop and would invest in new tools or in repairs that they had been putting off. The blacksmith would be busy again, working long hours to meet demand. The autumn weather would be more pleasant than summer, with cooler temperatures that would make working near the forge more bearable. However, autumn would also bring awareness that winter was approaching, and the blacksmith would need to make preparations. He would need to accumulate a supply of coal or charcoal sufficient to last through the winter months, when obtaining fuel might be difficult. He would need to make any necessary repairs to his smithy to ensure it could be used in cold weather. He would need to complete as much work as possible while the weather was still good. Winter would be the most challenging season for a blacksmith in many ways. The cold would make the smithy difficult to work in, as the area away from the forge would be freezing. The blacksmith's hands would become numb and stiff from the cold, making delicate work difficult. The metal itself would be cold to start with, requiring more fuel and time to heat it to working temperature. The water in the quenching trough might freeze overnight, and the blacksmith would need to break through the ice or would need to keep a small fire going overnight to prevent freezing. The short winter days would limit the hours available for work. The blacksmith would need to start work after dawn and would need to stop when darkness fell, as working by lamplight or candlelight would be difficult and dangerous. This would reduce his productive hours compared to summer, when daylight lasted much longer. The reduced working hours would mean reduced income just when fuel costs would be highest due to the need to heat the smithy. Winter storms might make it impossible for customers to reach the smithy, cutting off business for days at a time. Snow and ice might block roads and make travel dangerous. Customers who had urgent needs would have to wait until the weather cleared, and both the customer and the blacksmith would be frustrated by the delays. During extended storms, the blacksmith might have no work at all and no income, yet he would still need to heat the smithy to prevent his tools and materials from being damaged by freezing. The variation in business from season to season created financial planning challenges. The blacksmith would need to save money from busy periods to cover expenses during slow periods, but this was difficult when income was barely adequate even in good times. The uncertainty about when customers would come and how much work would be available created constant anxiety. The blacksmith could not simply work steadily, year-round at a predictable pace, but rather had to adapt constantly to changing demand and changing conditions. Weather events could create sudden demand for blacksmith services. A storm might damage buildings, requiring hinges, locks, and other hardware to be repaired or replaced. A flood might damage tools and equipment. These disaster-related jobs would create busy periods, but would also mean working under pressure to help the community recover. The blacksmith would be expected to prioritize emergency repairs over routine work, even though the routine work might be more profitable. The cumulative effect of seasonal variations was to make the blacksmith's work life even more unpredictable and stressful than it would be otherwise. The physical challenges would be compounded by heat in summer and cold in winter. The business cycle would create feast or famine income patterns. The weather would interfere with work in various ways. That would be frustrating and would be beyond the blacksmith's control. These seasonal challenges would add yet another layer of difficulty to an already extremely challenging occupation. Chapter 10. Family, Life and Domestic Responsibilities. The medieval blacksmith did not simply work at his trade. He also had a family and domestic responsibilities that would add to his burdens and would complicate his already difficult life. Let us examine the blacksmith's family situation and understand how domestic concerns would interact with his work obligations. Most blacksmiths would be married, as marriage was expected of adult men in medieval society and was economically necessary. The blacksmith would need a wife to manage the household, to prepare meals, to maintain clothing, and to handle various domestic tasks that he would not have time to do himself. The wife might also help with the business by keeping accounts, by dealing with customers when the blacksmith was busy at the forge, or by helping with lighter tasks. The blacksmith's wife would face her own set of challenges. She would need to manage a household on a limited and unpredictable income. She would need to prepare meals with whatever food was available and affordable, trying to stretch the family's resources to feed everyone adequately. She would need to maintain the home, which would be modest and would lack most comforts. She would need to care for children, which would be physically demanding and emotionally draining, especially given the high infant and child mortality rates. The relationship between the blacksmith and his wife would be shaped by the stresses they both faced. The blacksmith would come home each evening exhausted and perhaps irritable from a hard day of work. He would have little energy left for family interaction or for being emotionally supportive. The wife would be tired from her own work and would perhaps resent the blacksmith's focus on his trade to the exclusion of other concerns. The economic stress would create tensions, as there would be arguments about money and about priorities. Children would add both joy and burden to the blacksmith's life. Children were expected and desired in medieval society, as they represented the continuation of the family and would eventually be able to help with work. However, each child would also be another mouth to feed, another person requiring clothing and care, another drain on the family's limited resources. Infant mortality was high, and many children would die before reaching adulthood, creating grief and sadness for the parents. The children who did survive would be put to work at young ages. By age 5 or 6, children would be helping with household tasks appropriate to their abilities. By age 10 or 12, boys would be learning the blacksmith trade if they were to follow their father, or they would be apprenticed to other trades. Girls would be learning domestic skills and would be helping their mother with household work. The idea of childhood as a protected time of play and education did not exist in medieval society, and children would be miniature workers, contributing to family survival. The blacksmith, who had sons, would face the question of whether to train them in his trade. Taking on his own son as an apprentice would mean having help in the smithy, as the boy learned, but it would also mean having another person to feed and house while the boy was still learning and was not yet productive. The father would need to be patient with his son's mistakes and would need to teach skills that had taken him years to master. The relationship between father and son would be complicated by the mix of family bonds and the master-apprentice hierarchy. If the blacksmith's sons did not follow him into the trade, he would need to arrange apprenticeships for them with other craftsmen, which might require paying fees. If he had daughters, he would need to arrange marriages for them, which would require providing dowries. These obligations would create additional financial pressure on the already struggling blacksmith. Failing to properly provide for his children might require paying fees. If he had daughters, he would need to arrange marriages for them, which would require providing dowries. These obligations would create additional financial pressure on the already struggling blacksmith. Failing to properly provide for his children would bring shame on the blacksmith and would be seen as a dereliction of his duties as a father. The blacksmith's home would be closely connected to his work, as the smithy would typically be part of the same building or would be immediately adjacent to the living quarters. This meant that the noise, smoke, and heat from the smithy would affect the home. The family would be constantly exposed to the sound of hammering, which would make conversation difficult and would disturb sleep. The smoke from the forge would infiltrate the living areas, making the home smell of coal and metal. The boundary between work and home would be blurred, and there would be little escape from the demands and unpleasantness of the trade. The close connection between home and smithy also meant that the family's security was tied to the smithy. If the smithy burned down, which was of real risk given the open flames and the wooden construction of buildings, the family would lose both their livelihood and their home. If the blacksmith became ill or injured and could not work, the family would face immediate economic crisis. There was no insurance, no disability payments, no safety net beyond whatever help might be provided by family members or by the community's charity. The blacksmith's wife might take in extra work to supplement the family income. She might do spinning or weaving, might take in laundry, might prepare food to sell, or might do other tasks that could be done from home. This additional work would add to her already heavy burden of household management and child care, but it might be necessary for the family to survive. The pressure on both husband and wife to work constantly would leave little time for rest or for enjoying family life. Religious obligations would also place demands on the blacksmith and his family. They would be expected to attend church regularly, which would take time away from work. The family would be expected to contribute to church fundraising and to support religious activities, which would cost money that could barely be spared. Religious festivals and holy days would require time off from work, which meant lost income, though these occasions might at least provide some break from routine and some opportunity for community celebration. The blacksmith would worry constantly about his family's welfare. He would worry about whether he could feed his children adequately. He would worry about illness, knowing that medical care was limited and that a serious illness could be fatal. He would worry about his wife's health, particularly during pregnancies and childbirth, which were dangerous even in the best circumstances. He would worry about what would happen to his family if he died, knowing that his wife and children would be left with few resources and few options. This family context adds another dimension to understanding why being a medieval blacksmith sucked. The blacksmith was not just an individual suffering through hard work and difficult conditions. He was also a husband and father with responsibilities and concerns that extended beyond his own survival. The need to provide for family would drive him to keep working, even when his body was failing. The love for his children would be mixed with anxiety about their futures. The relationship with his wife would be strained by poverty and constant stress. Family, which might be a source of comfort and meaning, would also be a source of additional pressure and worry in the challenging life of a medieval blacksmith. Chapter 11. Final comprehensive assessment. As we bring this exhaustive examination to a close, let us take one final comprehensive look at why being a medieval blacksmith truly sucked, synthesizing all the various challenges and hardships we have explored into a complete picture of this difficult occupation. From the moment of waking before dawn, in a cold and uncomfortable bed, through the lengthy process of starting the forge fire, through hours of hot, exhausting, dangerous work, through inadequate meals eaten quickly while still hungry, through the afternoon when fatigue made every task harder, through the evening cleaning and preparation for the next day, to the collapse into bed with aching muscles and damaged lungs. Every moment of the blacksmith's day would be marked by discomfort and difficulty. The physical toll would be comprehensive and progressive. The heat would damage the skin and would cause chronic dehydration. The smoke would destroy the lungs. The noise would cause deafness. The repetitive motions would create joint problems and chronic pain. The burns would leave permanent scars. The metal dust would accumulate in the body. The poor posture would damage the spine. The cumulative effect would be a body that aged prematurely and that suffered from multiple chronic conditions that would worsen over time until the blacksmith could no longer function. The economic situation would be perpetually precarious. The costs of materials and fuel would consume much of the revenue. Customers would haggle and would sometimes refuse to pay. The income would be irregular, with busy periods alternating with slow periods. There would be no savings, no financial cushion, no security. One serious problem, whether an injury and illness, a major equipment failure, or an extended period without customers, could push the blacksmith into serious financial crisis from which recovery might be impossible. The social position would offer little consolation. The blacksmith would be respected for his necessary skills, but would not be admired or envied. He would be a middle-ranked craftsman, neither wealthy nor destitute, neither powerful nor powerless. He would need to show deference to his social superiors while accepting disrespect from both them. He would be somewhat marginalized by the noise and dirt of his trade and by the folklore that cast shadows over his work with fire and iron. The work itself would be mind-numbingly repetitive despite requiring significant skill. The same tasks would be performed day after day, year after year, with no variation except in the specific items being produced. The creativity required would be minimal, as most work would be making standard items to traditional patterns. The intellectual challenge would be low, as the blacksmith would be doing things he had learned years earlier, and would be using the same techniques over and over. The work would engage the body but not the mind, creating both physical exhaustion and mental boredom. The training to become a blacksmith would be brutal, involving years of harsh apprenticeship where the young person would be essentially a servant, performing the most menial tasks while being subjected to physical punishment and verbal abuse. The achievement of becoming a journeyman and then a master would be significant, but would not bring the rewards that might have been hoped for, as being a master blacksmith would simply mean bearing all the responsibilities and stresses we have detailed. The point family responsibilities would add emotional complexity to the physical and economic challenges. The blacksmith would work not just for himself, but for his wife and children, and this would give meaning to his labor, but would also add pressure and worry. The point inability to provide adequately for his family, the constant fear that illness or accident might leave them destitute, the knowledge that his children would likely face similar hardships in their own lives. All of these would weigh on the blacksmith's mind and would make his burden heavier. The lack of any prospect for improvement would be perhaps the most dispiriting aspect of all. The blacksmith would know that his life would not get better, that his work would not become easier, that his financial situation would not improve significantly, no matter how hard he worked. There would be no hope of advancement, no possibility of escape from his circumstances, no reason to expect that the future would be brighter than the present. He would simply endure, day after difficult day until death brought release. Comparing the medieval blacksmith's life to modern working conditions makes the contrast stark and makes us appreciate how much progress has been made. Modern metalworkers, if they do anything resembling traditional blacksmithing, work in well-ventilated workshops with power tools that make the work far less physically demanding. They have safety equipment including gloves, goggles, and respirators that protect them from the hazards of the trade. They work regular hours with overtime, pay and benefits. They have workers' compensation if injured and health insurance to cover medical care. They can retire with a pension. The work is still demanding, but it is incomparably easier and safer than what the medieval blacksmith faced. The modern person would find the medieval blacksmith's life completely intolerable. The absence of all the comforts, conveniences, and protections we take for granted would be shocking. The constant pain, the perpetual hunger, the chronic exhaustion, the economic insecurity, the lack of medical care, the social constraints, the absence of hope, all of these would combine to make life as a medieval blacksmith a nightmare from which there was no waking. Yet medieval blacksmiths lived these lives, day after day, year after year, because they had no choice, and because they had never known anything different. They found meaning where they could, in their families, in their faith, in their pride in skilled work, in the respect of their communities for their necessary services. They endured because humans are remarkably resilient and can adapt to almost any circumstances when given no alternative. But that does not mean their lives were good or that we should romanticize their experience. The doinked medieval blacksmith's life sucked in almost every measurable way. It was physically painful, economically insecure, socially limiting, intellectually unstimulating, and emotionally draining. It offered few rewards and many hardships. It damaged the body, limited the spirit, and offered little hope for anything better. It was a life to be endured rather than enjoyed, survived, rather than thrived in. As you drift into sleep now in your comfortable modern bed, in your climate-controlled room, with your healthy body and your economic security and your freedom and your prospects for a good future, take a moment to feel genuinely grateful. Be grateful that you live in a time when work like the medieval blacksmiths is no longer necessary. Be grateful for the centuries of technological progress that have eliminated such brutal physical labor. Be grateful for the social progress that has created labor protections and economic security. Be grateful for the medical advances that prevent and treat the conditions that would have killed or disabled the medieval blacksmith. The specific challenges of individual blacksmithing tasks would exemplify all the difficulties we have discussed. Consider the process of making a single simple nail, one of the most basic products a blacksmith might create. The blacksmith would take an iron rod and heat it in the forge until it glowed orange. He would then remove it with tongs and place it on the anvil. Using a hammer, he would flatten one end to create the head of the nail, striking repeatedly with careful aim to spread the metal evenly. This process required the iron to be at exactly the right temperature. Too cool, and the metal would not spread properly. Too hot, and it would spark and burn. The blacksmith would need to judge by color and by how the metal responded to the hammer. He would have seconds to complete the hammering before the iron cooled too much, requiring him to return it to the forge for reheating. For a simple nail head, he might need 2 or 3 heating cycles. Once the head was formed, the blacksmith would reheat the rod and then cut it to the appropriate length using a chisel or a hardie, which was a cutting tool that fit into the square hole in the anvil. He would place the rod over the hardie and strike it with a hammer, cutting through the hot iron. The cut would not be clean like a modern wire cutter, but would be rough and would require additional work to clean up. The blacksmith would then need to taper the cut end to create the point of the nail. This would require more heating and hammering, carefully shaping the iron to a gradual point that would be able to penetrate wood without bending or breaking. The tapering would need to be even on all sides, which required rotating the iron and hammering from multiple angles. Each rotation and each hammer blow would need to be precise, and the blacksmith's hand and eye would need to work together with the skill developed over years of practice. Finally, the completed nail would be set aside to cool, and the blacksmith would begin the process again for the next nail. If a customer ordered 100 nails, the blacksmith would need to repeat this process 100 times. Each nail might take 2 to 3 minutes to complete, meaning that making 100 nails would take perhaps 4 to 5 hours of continuous work. The repetitive nature of this task would be mind-numbing, and the physical demands would accumulate as the hours passed. The production of more complex items would involve all the same basic processes, but would require even more skill, time, and effort. Creating a sword blade, for instance, would be a project that might take days or even weeks. The blacksmith would need to start with a bar of high-quality steel, which itself would be expensive and difficult to obtain. He would need to heat and hammer the steel repeatedly, gradually shaping it into the long, narrow form of a blade. The hammering would need to be extremely precise to create an even taper from the thick spine to the thin cutting edge. Any imperfection would weaken the blade or would affect its balance and handling. The blacksmith would need to constantly assess the shape and thickness, making minute adjustments through careful hammer blows. The process would require hundreds or thousands of hammer strikes, each needing to be placed exactly right. Once the rough shape was achieved, the blacksmith would need to grind the blade to create the final edge geometry and to smooth the surfaces. This grinding would be done using whetstones and files, and it would be tedious, time-consuming work that would strain the arms and hands. The blacksmith would need to maintain consistent angles and pressure to create an even edge, and any lapse in concentration could ruin hours of work. The hardening and tempering of the blade would be perhaps the most critical and nerve-wracking part of the process. The blacksmith would heat the blade to a specific temperature, judged by color, and would then quench it in water or oil to harden the steel. This rapid cooling would make the steel hard but also brittle. If the heating was uneven or if the quenching was not done properly, the blade might crack or warp, destroying all the work that had been done. After hardening, the blade would need to be tempered, which involved heating it again to a lower temperature to reduce brittleness while maintaining hardness. This tempering required even more careful temperature control, as overheating would soften the blade too much while underheating would leave it too brittle. The blacksmith would watch the colors that appeared on the heated steel, looking for specific shades of yellow, purple, or blue that indicated the right temperature. His eyes would be strained from staring at the subtle color changes, and his nerves would be taut with the knowledge that a mistake at this stage would ruin the blade. Even after all this work, the blade would still need a handle, which might be made by the blacksmith, or might be fitted by another craftsman. The total time and effort invested in creating a single sword would be enormous, and the price the blacksmith could charge would need to reflect this investment. However, not all customers would be willing or able to pay what the work was truly worth, and the blacksmith might need to accept a lower price than his labor deserved. These specific examples of blacksmithing tasks help us understand that it was not just the general conditions of the work that made being a blacksmith difficult. It was also the specific demands of each task, the need for constant precision and skill, the physical effort required for even simple items, the mental concentration needed to avoid mistakes, and the economic pressure to work quickly and efficiently while maintaining quality. Every nail, every horseshoe, every tool, every piece of hardware represented hours of difficult work under challenging conditions. The cumulative weight of these specific tasks, performed day after day for years, would grind down even the strongest person. The blacksmith would never be able to relax fully, never be able to approach his work casually, never be able to take shortcuts without risking his reputation and his livelihood. The constant pressure to perform skilled work Work under difficult conditions with inadequate tools and minimal reward would make being a medieval blacksmith an exhausting, frustrating, and ultimately soul-crushing experience. The Pema has fallen silent in the Pema smithy. The forge has grown cold. The anvil stands unused. The Pema to smoke has cleared and the heat has dissipated. The medieval blacksmith and all his suffering are in the past, preserved only in historical records and in long, boring stories designed to help you fall asleep. And that is exactly where they should stay. Good night, dear listener. May your sleep be peaceful, your body comfortable, and your dreams free from the heat and smoke and pain of the medieval smithy. May you wake tomorrow to a modern world where such hardships are history, where work is safer and easier, where life is longer and healthier, where the tools are better and the conditions more humane. The medieval blacksmith would envy you beyond measure if he could see your life. Sleep well and be grateful for all the progress that separates your comfortable existence from his daily suffering. The bont long day at the forge is over, the fire is banked, and it is time to rest. Good night, and may your dreams be free from hammering and heat.